The summer of 1684, Madrid beneath a merciless sun. The air over the city hung heavy, trapped between the dust of its narrow streets and the stone bulk of the royal Alcazar. Inside those cavernous halls where the court of Spain carried on its glittering ceremonies, the atmosphere felt motionless, as if suffocating under invisible weights. Lavender water had been sprinkled over marble floors. Bowls of rose petals were set in corners, refreshed each morning by weary servants. Yet the perfume of flowers clashed with another odor, thicker rancor and impossible to ignore. It was not the heat alone that made courtiers discreetly raise handkerchiefs to their noses or shift nervously. As a young princess, past whispers rippled behind her like the rustle of silk. "Her Highness is coming," murmured one lady to another, lips barely moving. Attendants rushed to spritz the air with scented waters, hoping to drown the stench in rose or orange blossom. But the relief was temporary at best. A moment later, the smell cut through, once more bitter and unrelenting. The just 19 years old Princess Margarita Teresa, daughter of King Philip, the Fourth of Spain, a niece to her own mother, Mariana of Austria, carried with her an odor so potent that it defeated the most expensive perfumes of Europe. Observers likened it to rotting fish left in stagnant water or damp straw covered in mildew. No matter how many baths she endured, no matter how many concoctions the perfumes devised, soaps of goat's milk, infusions of rosemary, even vinegar rinses, the odor returned. In a century when bathing was itself suspect, often feared to open the body's pores to disease, most courtiers staved off smell by layering garments and drowning themselves in scent. A noble might change linen several times a day or pour entire bottles of imported cologne into their wigs. Yet Margarita Teresa stood apart while others managed to mask their natural musk. Hers was overpowering. Gilded rooms reeked when she entered, and whispers claimed the tapestries retained her scent long after she departed. Some dismissed it as exaggeration, gossip sharpened by rival factions. But servants knew better. They burned incense in her chambers until the smoke stung their eyes. They boiled herbs in cauldrons and smeared thick pastes of thyme and sage across her skin. At times she submitted to scalding baths laced with and salt remedies thought to draw impurities from the flesh. Still the stench persisted. The affliction was not mere misfortune. It was a symptom of something deeper woven into the blood of her dynasty. For generations the House of Hapsburg had guarded its crown by marrying within its own circle. Uncles took nieces, cousins bound themselves to cousins. Philip, the Fourth himself, had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, believing the union politically convenient. But the cost of such arrangements grew heavier with each generation. Twisted jaws, swollen tongues, feeble limbs, and now a young princess who could not escape the smell of decay. Clinging to her skin from across the chamber on Diego Villa's Case de Silva, the court painter watched silently. His brush had captured the faces of Spain's rulers for decades. He had painted them in triumphal armor in brocade gowns, beneath crowns heavy with jewels. But behind the finery, he had witnessed another story, the slow unraveling of flesh and bone, the dynasty's grandeur slipping into grotesque glory. Each portrait bore sharper evidence of the so-called Hapsburg jaw, each child a more fragile vessel than the one before. Now, as Margarita, Teresa glided past. Velasquez remembered the words of the royal physician, Luis Marcato. "This is the price of pure blood." Marcato had tried years before to sound the alarm. In 1605, he published his treatise Morbid Heritage Stories, warning that repeated consanguinity would produce children frail, sickly, and in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. His warnings, however, were drowned out by politics. Bloodlines were guarded more fiercely than health. To dilute royal blood with outsiders was considered a greater risk than deformity itself. So the marriages continued and the consequences multiplied. Meanwhile, in the palace kitchens, Maria, a cook who had served 3 generations of Hapsburgs, stirred a steaming pot of herbs. The scent of rosemary and thyme filled the hot, smoky room. She crushed the leaves into a thick paste, muttering to herself, "Poor girl, none of this is her fault." Recipes to mask the princess's odor changed with every season. Rosemary rubs in spring, juniper smoke in winter, vinegar compresses when nothing else worked. Yet none lasted long. The smell clung stubbornly, as if bred into her blood itself. The door banged open, the high steward, drenched in sweat, barked orders. "Hurry. With that remedy, Her Highness must meet the French ambassador." Maria crossed herself before ladling the mixture into a silver bowl. Even she doubted it would help. The ambassador waiting in the reception chamber was Jean-Baptiste, called the Marquis of Tossy. His pen was as sharp as his gaze. For months, he had sent dispatches back to Vichy, each more damning than the last King Louis XIV to France received reports of the Spanish royals' fragility, their deformities, the whispered humiliations. Every detail became a weapon in negotiation. A weak dynasty was a vulnerable one. And now Colburn would carry back yet another tale of a princess so afflicted that her smell clung to the corridors of Madrid's palace. Upstairs, Margarita Teresa stood still as her ladies dressed her for the formal audience. Tears welled but did not fall. Powder was thickly brushed over her pale skin. Rouge painted onto her lips. Jewels clasped around her neck until she seemed more statue than girl. Still, the mirrors betrayed her. They reflected the Hapsburg law, the sunken eyes, the skin so translucent it carried a sickly hue. "Your Highness, the ambassador awaits." The chamberlain announced from the doorway. Careful not to inhale too deeply. Marguerite had studied herself as she had been taught since childhood. She raised her chin, summoned what remained of her pride, and whispered the words expected of her. "Let him enter." But court gossips are the details never written in official chronicles. They claimed that at a royal ball, a young noblewoman fainted when Margarita Teresa approached too closely. Others whispered. The priests urged her to carry pouches of burning amber on a chain at her waist, so the smoke might veil her scent. Superstitious servants even suggested that the odor was a sign of demonic affliction punishment for the family's pride. Hygiene itself was a battlefield of superstition. Many nobles bathed only twice a year, fearing water would invite illness. Instead, they rubbed scented cloths over their skin, powdered their wigs with flour, and dabbed perfume on gloves. Margarita did all these and more. She soaked her gowns in rose water, changed linen multiple times a day, slept between sheets sprinkled with lavender. Yet by morning, the smell seeped through again. Some courtiers swore it grew worse after meals. Others claimed it clung strongest to her hair. Ambassadors described it in code. A Venetian envoy noted that the princess carries an atmosphere most peculiar. A French diplomat wrote that one must admire her lineage from afar. These veiled phrases masked open ridicule. But a court obsessed with appearances, the princess's scent became a cruel shorthand for decline. For Margarita herself, the ordeal was unending shame. Letters suggest she often begged her confessors for guidance. Fearing that her condition was divine punishment, she endured endless baths and harsh solutions. Her skin left raw, yet each effort failed. And when she stepped into the audience chamber, every noble eye judged her not for her words or manners, but for the invisible cloud that followed her like a curse. In another section of the Alcazar, her younger brother Carlos, only 12, and already proclaimed heir to the throne of Spain, hunched over a book. His weary tutor struggled to coax him into reading. Though hope was fading quickly, Carlos, his tongue was oversized, making clear speech nearly impossible. His deformed jaw mangled even the simplest sounds. His bowed legs, weakened by rickets, rendered each step painful. He was plagued with seizures, intellectually lagged far behind other boys of his age. "Majesty, let us try again," urged the tutor, masking his exasperation. Carlos blinked sluggishly, eyes wandering away from the page, drawn instead toward the gardens, visible through tall windows. There he watched noble children racing across the grass, strong and carefree. He had never joined them. He never could. His delicate body and feeble health imprisoned him inside these opulent chambers, shielded from even trivial dangers. A simple cold might end his life. Meanwhile, in the council chamber, King Philip, the fourth, aged and wary, conferred with his ministers. War with France had drained Spain's treasury. The colonies overseas seethed with discontent. The economy tottered. Yet none of these burdens troubled the king as deeply as the question of succession. "Your Majesty must contemplate a marriage for Prince," Carlos advised the Duke of Medina, the Prime Minister. "He is still young." "Yes, but securing the loan must be urgent." Philip stroked his graying beard. In his heart, he knew the bitter truth his son might never sire in a court. Physicians had spoken in confidence. Carlos likely suffered from hypogonadism, his fertility gravely impaired, perhaps beyond salvation. What princess of Europe would accept him as husband, knowing his affliction? Still, Philip voiced no doubts. He gave a solemn nod, seek prospects among the houses of France, Austria, and Portugal. He commanded present suitable candidates to the council. What remained unspoken, though understood by all, was the deeper motive. The dynasty's fixation on blood purity, preservation of the line outweighed all else. And each generation paid a steeper price as the council scribbled notes. A messenger burst into the chamber. He bowed deeply, presenting a sealed letter. Philip tore open the wax with trembling hands. His pale face drained of what color remained as he read. "There has been an incident," he whispered, his voice faltering. The reception with the French ambassador had been disrupted. Princess Margarita Teresa had collapsed mid-audience. Shock rippled through the room. This was not her first fainting. All present understood the implication. Her health was as frail as her brother's. A German consul. Philip murmured, rising stiffly. "I must see my daughter," as he walked the corridors toward her chambers. A crushing weight settled on him. Years ago, he had married his own niece, Mariana of Austria, after losing his first wife. Believing it wise and politically prudent, he had never reckoned with what such choices meant for his children. Now, watching them suffer, twisted in body, diminished in mind, their futures fading, guilt pressed upon him like an iron crown. Deep within the royal library, a single candle flickered beside the bowed figure of the court physician. His brow furrowed as he pored over aged manuscripts, fingers trembling as he turned the brittle pages. He searched desperately for knowledge, some clue that might explain the unraveling of Spain's once mighty dynasty. His eyes paused on a passage from Louis Mercado, his long-ignored treatise. The repeated joining of blood to closely related produces children frail, prone to sickness, deformity, and in the worst cases, incapable of creating errors. The doctor exhaled heavily and shot the book. There were no remedies hidden in those pages, only warnings. The crown had chosen to disregard. Outside, thunder rumbled as dark clouds gathered above Madrid, mirroring the turmoil inside the gilded walls of the Alcazar. The air carried the damp scent of stone mixed with fading lavender. A reminder of Princess Margarita Teresa's condition. That odor had become more than a physical curse. It was now a symbol of decline, the sign of a bloodline collapsing under its own legacy. Time was running short. The bells of the Alcazar Tower rang at noon on a brisk November day in 1679. Across the city, church bells joined in as the royal family processed into the Cathedral of Santa Sidra. This was no ordinary mass. It marked the marriage of Carlos, the second 18 years old and king since the age of 4, to Maria Luisa of Orleans, spirited niece of Louis XIV to France. She had arrived in Madrid just a week earlier. Rumors spread that the young bride had wept bitterly after first seeing her intended husband. Few could blame her. Despite all efforts of attendants, powders, perfumes, fine garments, Carlos cut a pitiful figure, thin, sickly, and marked by the infamous Hapsburg jaw, so enlarged he could not fully close his mouth. He required the support of 2 aides simply to remain upright during the ceremony. Cardinal Portocarrero presided over the ritual, his voice trembling as he fought to maintain solemnity while the king struggled. When the moment came for Carlos to declare his vows, silence filled the cathedral. His tongue, far too large, distorted his speech into a faint, high-pitched mumble. The congregation held its breath, uncertain whether to pity or recoil. Among the pews, Doña Elvira de Montemayor, a noblewoman in her 70s, leaned close to her granddaughter. "Look at his hands," she whispered. The girl glanced carefully. The king's fingers quivered as he slid the ring onto his bride's hand. "Will he be able to have children?" she asked softly. Donna Elvira frowned at the boldness, but the thought plagued everyone present at the very front. Queen Mother Mariana of Austria maintained a composed expression. She had ruled behind the scenes throughout her son's minority and intended to retain her influence in the shadows. The imperial ambassador, Karl Tarik, observed closely, already drafting notes for Vienna. The king can scarcely stand. His frailty is so severe that it seems improbable he will ever consummate the marriage, much less father and heir. After the wedding ceremony, the royal entourage made its way back to the Alcazar for the feast. Carlos II, drained from the effort of the morning, excused himself and retreated to his chambers before the celebrations began. His physicians gave him yet another better tonic, a concoction of herbs, minerals, and animal extracts, one of countless remedies. They had attempted to fortify his failing frame. His Majesty must save his strength. One whispered to another, eyes flicking toward the bed. They all knew the truth. Tonight was the night of consummation, or at least it was supposed to be. In the great hall, the festivities unfolded with full pomp. Long tables bent under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and gleaming silver platters. Nobles, envoys, and clerics raised cups in force cheer toasting the union. Yet many observed the king scarcely touched his food, his jaw painful and misshapen, made during nearly impossible. He confined himself to broths and soft purees at the head of the table. The Duke of Medina Ali, the king's chief counselor, studied the scene in silence, his expression heavy. Look how the foreign envoys gazed at him. He muttered to the constable of Castile, like vultures circling a dying beast. The constable nodded grimly. All knew that European powers were already maneuvering for the day the king died without an heir. Louis XIV of France had prepared meticulously alliances, secret pacts, diplomatic schemes, all awaiting this very scenario. The music shifted as court musicians struck up a soft tune and dancers began to move gracefully across the floor. Carlos sat stiffly beside his new queen, Maria Luisa. Though she had shed tears earlier, she had composed herself for the evening. She smiled faintly, whispered gentle words, and played her role. Not far off, the aging poet Francisco de Quevedo watched with sharp eyes, bent and frail, but still perceptive. He leaned toward a companion. Look into the king's eyes, he murmured. The youth obeyed, then nodded. There is sorrow and emptiness. It is the weight of a dying bloodline, Quevedo replied. No crown can shield him from it. Elsewhere, whispers swirled. Maria de Cardona made to the queen, leading to her mother, a long-serving court lady. The queen fears tonight, Shima, that she's heard troubling things about the king's body. Her mother hushed her, but confirmed the rumors privately. Malformed genitals, possible sterility, whispered afflictions of a line bound too tightly to itself. As midnight approached, the royal couple was ceremoniously led toward their chambers. This was no private moment, though not directly witnessed. The act was encased in tradition and expectation for Carlos. Frail and dazed attendants undressed him, perfumed him, and gave another potion spiced and laced with supposed aphrodisiacs. He drank without objection. Maria Luisa was similarly prepared by her ladies. Her gown removed, hair combed and perfumed, reassured with quiet counsel. Remember, Your Majesty, urged the Duchess of Terranova, her chief attendant. The fate of Spain rests upon this night. The young queen nodded nervously in a nearby chapel. Monks prayed fervently. Father Mateo de Moya, the king's confessor, begged heaven, grant our sovereign strength, O Lord, courage to fulfill his sacred charge. Yet even he wondered silently, if Carlos's suffering was itself a divine message that perhaps heaven willed the dynasty to end. In his study, Dr. Juan Bautista Junini, the king's physician, wrote notes by candlelight, a man inspired by the newest schools of medicine in France and Italy. He attempted to introduce modern remedies to the Spanish court. Yet he met constant opposition from traditionalists who clung to the belief that illness stemmed from imbalanced humors or the work of demons. The king's condition is not spiritual nor humoral, which means he scribbled. It is structural. It arises from repeated concern-genius unions which do not dilute flaws but intensify them. His observations were centuries ahead of their time, too advanced for his contemporaries, but they would later be confirmed by science. At dawn following the wedding, curiosity buzzed throughout the palace. No public inspection of the nuptial sheets was conducted out of respect for royal dignity. But gossip ran unchecked. The marriage had not been consummated, not that night, nor for many afterward. The whispers grew. Carlos was either too frail, too frightened, or entirely incapable of anxiety rippled through Europe's courts. Without an heir, speculation over succession intensified, Spain's throne. And with it, a global empire seemed destined to fall into contest as weeks stretched into months, then into years. Pressure only mounted. Foreign physicians arrived with new concoctions, strange herbs, metallic tinctures, even alchemical mixtures. Some promised marvels. None succeeded. They attempted baths in the blood of bulls and chickens. Even more exotic beasts' talismans were smuggled in, exorcisms performed in secret. One bizarre ritual required bathing the king's loins in the fresh blood of a goat. Yet nothing changed Carlos. His condition remained. If he carried seed, it yielded no life. Over the years, hope itself waned much later. Modern genetics would reveal the truth. Carlos likely carried multiple recessive disorders. Perhaps Kleinfeld felt a syndrome. perhaps androgen insensitivity. Such conditions explained his features, his slow development, and most damning, his infertility. By 1689, a decade into a barren marriage, Maria Louisa of Orleans suddenly died at Archelieu. The official cause ruptured appendix. Yet whispers said she had simply lost the will to endure. Carlos sank into despair, but duty gave no time for grief. Within months, he married again. This time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess famed for her fertile family. Her mother had birthed 23 children. Still, the match produced nothing in the gardens of Alba. When Retiro, the royal botanist, José Curry Martinez, tended his collection of medicinal plants with quiet focus. Over the years, he had noticed a peculiar pattern in his experiments. When the same plants were crossbred too many times, their offspring weakened, more prone to blight and disease. It is as though nature resists inbreeding. He murmured to himself, never realizing how closely his botanical insights mirrored the tragedy unfolding in the palace. Not far away, Carlos II sat slumped on a stone bench, his gaze drifting upward to the birds, wailing across the sky. Despite his frailties, there were brief moments when the king seemed aware of the cruel irony of his life, a sovereign, unable to govern, a husband incapable of fatherhood, a ruler stripped of the one legacy expected of him. Sometimes I dream of a son, he once confided to his confessor, a strong boy to carry my name, but perhaps God does not wish it. The priest remained silent. How could he reveal that the king's fate was not divine will, but human folly? Centuries of politics overriding biology, sealing his destiny long before his birth. By the 1690s, the Spanish court had turned inward. Desperation hovered over every decision. Physicians clung to rituals steeped in superstition. Priests blamed devils. Courtiers whispered of curses. But nothing could halt the inevitable. On the morning of November, 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once more. Carlos, the second last sovereign of the Spanish Hapsburg line, was dead at 39. His body, wasted by a lifetime of disease, was placed in the royal chapel. One of his doctors. One day, Capriati stood in silence before the corpse. He had watched the king suffer through seizures, infections, digestive collapse, and finally failure of the kidneys. An autopsy was ordered. Rare in such cases, the results startled, even hardened physicians. The body lacked blood. The heart was no larger than a peppercorn. The lungs decayed. The intestines gangrenous. Only one testicle remained blackened and shriveled while the skull's cavity brimmed with fluid. Medicine of the age could not explain it to later generations. The conclusion was clear. This was the terminal stage of dynastic self-destruction. Even hope had died. The court assembled in the Alcazar to witness the reading of the king's last testament. The atmosphere was charged as the notary cracked the seal and prepared to declare the chosen heir. All present held their breath as a single name emerged. Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis, the 14th of France above. And the French envoy allowed himself a smirk while the Austrian ambassador scowled in open displeasure. The struggle for Spain's succession had begun. Yet beneath the maneuvering of diplomats and the clashing of dynasties lay a truth. None dared to speak aloud, but all understood. The Spanish Habsburg line had reached its natural end. The so-called purest blood in Europe had become its most brutal. This once great dynasty collapsed not through rebellion, not through conquest, but through its own design, a ticking genetic time bomb set centuries earlier. Carlos II remains today not a symbol of grandeur, but of consequence. His portrait hanging museums, his twisted jaw, vacant stare, and frail body, eternal reminders of a tragedy written into his very bones. They stand as warnings of what occurs when political obsession defies nature. When dynastic pride is placed above the laws of biology. When crowns are passed from uncle to niece again and again until the bloodline decays. The Hapsburgs of Spain, once unrivaled in their glory, extinguished themselves not with fire or sword but by their own blood. And within the hushed corridors of the Escorial, among marble tombs where Spain's monarchs lie in endless vigil rests. Carlos II. Beneath the weight of stone, he is remembered by a simple inscription, the last and most unfortunate of his line. No grand epitaph could disguise the bitter truth his reign embodied. He was the end of a dynasty that had ruled vast territories across continents, a house whose armies once shook Europe. Yet its downfall came not from battlefields or rebellions, but from within, concealed in the veins of its rulers. The Spanish Hapsburgs had pursued the ideal of untainted lineage, binding generation upon generation in marriages of kin. They preserved property and throne, but in the process weakened the very bodies meant to carry their legacy forward. Each new king bore sharper signs of decline until Carlos the Final became both monarch and monument to that decay. His life was marked not by triumph, but by frailty. Each seizure, each collapse, each whisper of infertility was another tolling bells for the dynasty's fate. His death at 39 was not merely the loss of a king but the extinguishing of a bloodline once thought immortal. What remained was absorbed by other powers. France rejoiced as Bourbon influence spread. Austria calculated its moves and Europe prepared for the wars that followed. But behind the clash of empires lay a silent lesson. No crown, no empire, no wealth can withstand the defiance of nature. Carlos II endures in history, less as a sovereign than as a warning. His portraits stare back at us across centuries, the protruding jaw and lifeless gaze, not only relics of his suffering but symbols of hubris. The arrogance of believing dynasties could outwit biology. And so the Spanish Hapsburgs, once masters of half the known world, vanished not through steel or flame, but through the quiet betrayal of their own blood.